Trauma is something we've all experienced, yet it's a topic that's rarely talked about. I believe that's because with trauma comes a lot of shame. You all know I'm a mental health advocate, and for me personally, talk therapy was such a significant part of my journey. But my mind was open to a whole new form of healing with this week's guest, Allie Cates. Allie is an emotional health coach and a somatic experience practitioner. Now, this is a topic I knew nothing about, but got so much value out of this conversation. Allie's been through extensive trauma, and I admire her for holding nothing back in this episode. But with that being said, I do want to say this episode comes with a trigger warning as we discuss sexual abuse and numbing with drugs and alcohol. In 2019, Allie's life was turned upside down when she was diagnosed with late-stage chronic Lyme, multiple autoimmunities, endometriosis, and the death of 7 loved ones within a 3-year period. This chapter brought up old and complex trauma Allie dealt with growing up that up until that point she had disassociated from. She knew she needed help with her mental health, and she tried psychotherapy, EMDR, CBT, and neuroplasticity, but nothing seemed to be helping. She found a trauma recovery coach who taught her how to remove the emotional charge out of her body, which is when she learned that trauma lives in the body and not the brain. She learned how to cope and heal from her complex developmental trauma, see PTSD, and has dedicated her life to helping others process their grief and develop strategies to transform their lives. Throughout this episode, she'll teach you about the trauma cycle and why so many of us are living in fight or flight. She explains disassociation, trauma bonding, and how trauma stuck in the body can ultimately make you sick and in physical pain. She explains how to access anger in a healthy way and how not to make healing your entire identity. This episode is beyond valuable and fascinating. I really admire Allie for using her pain for purpose. For Mental Health Awareness Month, I created 2 different and stylish tees that are not only fashionable but carry a strong and important message. Check out our website, morethanink.com, if you want to get your hands on one of these before they sell out. Now, please join me in welcoming the amazing Allie Cates to the I Am More Than podcast. Hey friends, I'm Jordan, but most people call me Jay, and I'm the host of the I Am More Than podcast. I'm a professional model, former Miss Arizona USA, entrepreneur, and confidence coach. But beyond those titles, I'm just an overly curious woman learning to become the best version of myself. And I'm hoping this podcast can help you do that too. I struggled a lot with my mental health and confidence in my early 20s and went on a deep dive into improving those areas of my life. I share about my journey on this podcast, as well as highlight the stories of admirable women who are just like you. We learn from each other, laugh, and cry, and I believe you'll grow after every episode because let's face it, when we realize we aren't alone, life becomes a whole lot easier. If you're a multifaceted woman interested in improving your confidence and mental health while being entertained, you've come to the right place. We're so happy to have you part of the More Than movement. Welcome to the I Am More Than podcast, Allie. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just really excited to be here, and I love everything that you are doing.
Back at you. I just feel like our worlds collided at the perfect time, and especially with May being Mental Health Awareness Month, I feel like this conversation is one that's not only needed all the time, but especially when it comes to talking about healing trauma.
Yeah.
That's not something you talk about often, but I think people are more open to the conversation when there's a dedicated time period, let's say, given to it. So even though trauma is not a sexy conversation, I'm excited to dive into it with you and really get to know how you became an emotional health coach. That's not something you hear all the time.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for having me here.
Of course. So I'm very curious to see what led you to becoming an emotional health coach. I know you have one hell of a story. So just take me through kind of the significant events that happened to bring you to this point.
Yeah. So my journey really starts, early on in childhood, but it kind of all comes to a head when I am 22. My husband and I lose 3 people in 9.5 months. And these deaths brought up all of my pain and trauma and childhood trauma that I had suppressed and completely disassociated from for years. it brought it up to the surface in a really big way. And I went on this mission to, help my mental health because I just crashed and burned. I remember having suicidal ideation. I had never had that before and just was at like my lowest low. And before this, I had gone on this journey of like doing CBT, EMDR, psychotherapy, hypnotherapy, brain rewiring, all of these things to help because I was like, oh my goodness, I'm feeling so out of body and all of this stuff's coming up in a really big way and I don't know how to process it. And so that was probably like 6 months of doing these different types of therapies and they never really worked because they were addressing the brain and not the body. And so, I was hitting an even lower low. And I had called the trauma recovery coach that I had found in town. And I was like, look, and he worked with veterans. And I was like, I don't think I have trauma. Like, I had, in my mind, it was like only people that had been to war have trauma. So there's no way that this like blonde haired, blue eyed, super privileged 22-year-old that like her parents just bought her a home and everything on paper looks perfect has trauma, right? Like, there's no way. And so I called him and I remember being on a bike ride with my husband because I was like so like I can't even describe it to you, but it's like almost like I wanted to like I was like itchy. Like it was like I was like crawling in my skin almost. I was like just so overwhelmed with it. And so the only thing I could do was get out of the house. It's like I just know I need to be out of the house. So I was on a bike ride with my husband and he called me and he goes, "Tell me a little bit about what's going on." And I was like, all these memories that I have literally forgotten about are coming up in my dreams and like I can't even go through the day without being like glazed over. Like I was so foggy and glazed over all the time. I couldn't even like focus on anything. He's like, "You're probably not going to believe me, but that's called trauma." And like I've done this for over 40 years and I used to specialize in just veterans and people that have been to war, but I saw that it's in everyday civilians and it doesn't live in your brain, it lives in your body. So I specifically work with the body on helping move the emotional charge out of your body. And I just cried. Like I was like, someone finally sees me because after you go through all of these things for your mental health, it's like, do this type of therapy, do that. My friend says, wake up this and meditate, do the cold plunge, do this. And it's like, none of those things were really giving me this like big release that I knew that my body needed. Like our bodies are so brilliant if we give them the space to actually heal. And so that was at 22. So then fast forward about 3 years, and I'm 3.5 weeks before my husband and I get married, and I get diagnosed with late stage Lyme and like 5 other autoimmune conditions. So we go through our wedding and our honeymoon, and I come back and sit in an IV room for 9.5 months, 3 to 4 times a week, 6 to 8 hours a day, have a port put in my chest. And I tell my husband that like this moment is breaking me to build me back up into the woman that I'm meant to be. Because at this point, I'm like, I never thought I would be in trauma recovery. I never thought I'd be a coach in this space. But I really believe that being in that IV room and being sick and being like broken to the core allowed me to like step into this space. And so in that IV room, I heard from people that were talking about, similar things of just people, everyone's been through something, right? Like none of us go unscathed. We all have a story. And then it kind of, after I got out of the IV room, I had the beginning of sepsis in my port. So I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. Had a completely different like healing journey. And when the thing that helped me really start to heal was like stepping into my business. And I started with a podcast actually originally because I could do it from my bed. I could do it from my couch. And then went on to become a trauma recovery coach, so certified in that. And now I am getting my practitioner training in somatic experiencing, which is about helping actually move the emotional charge out of the body.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's so much of your story that I'm so fascinated by, but you had made a comment that you could literally feel in your body. It's like you needed to get out of your skin.
Yes.
And all these memories from your past were coming up through dreams. And I had a very similar experience when I was, I think, 24, living in New York, and everything on paper looked great. My life had never been better.
Yeah.
But it was like I felt glazed over or I was so anxious, and all these very vivid memories that even though the memories themselves didn't in my mind seem traumatic, they kept getting replayed over and over and over again. And I couldn't understand why. And I took those signals as I just need to get into therapy, really is the only way that I felt like if I could talk through it, I could try and understand. But this is the first time I've ever really hearing that a trauma response can live in your body.
Oh, yeah.
So when you were feeling that, and now that you have the knowledge that you do, what is that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the best way to describe this, are you like a visual learner?
Very.
Okay. So I'm going to like paint this picture in your head. And if you're like, Allie, this doesn't make sense, then I will paint a different picture. But I want you to imagine like, and this is somatic experiencing. So this gentleman named Peter Levine came up with somatic experiencing. And what he brought to trauma recovery was how animals in the wild do not get traumatized. Okay. But
Okay.
how humans get traumatized. So how specifically prey do not stay in a space of fight or flight, right? When you think about it. Like, do you have a dog?
Yes.
You know, when your dog gets scared and it has like a ridge
Mm-hmm.
and then it shakes,
Mm-hmm.
that's because it discharges its emotional charge. So then it doesn't stay in this place of being traumatized. So this is how trauma works really. Is trauma's not about, I mean, yes, there's like part of it that's about the event, but it's really about how it left your nervous system after said event, right? So we're going to go through this circle and I think you're probably going to release the video, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And
Okay. So
so much is clicking in my brain right now. Oh my gosh.
I love it when that happens. Okay, so this is called like a stress response cycle, or we can call it a trauma cycle. So essentially, there's a trigger at the top, right? Then you go into fight or flight. Okay. Then you go into a release or a discharge, and then you go into rest and digest.
Okay.
Most people go from being triggered, fight or flight, and they build this emotional charge. They never get to this discharge portion of it. So that emotional charge goes into your body and it specifically lives in what's called your fascia tissue. And your fascia tissue can hold 1,000 pounds of emotional charge.
Wow.
So when you think about it, it's like those feelings. Like, I don't know if you've ever done yoga or gone for a run and you like start crying and people are like, it feels old. Like, you're like, these are old tears. Like, this isn't happening right now. And that is literally how trauma is stored in the body, is you're tapping on that old charge that never got to get released. Yeah.
That's and the only way to have that move through your body, is it specific and targeted, or can it happen without us being intentional about it happening?
I mean, both. I think, when we're talking about when I work with clients, it's definitely like we're working specifically on doing different techniques to release it out of the body. So through like somatic experiencing or myofascial releasing. But there are other times, like right when you're in yoga or you're working out and you like start crying, or the anger is a really big one. Like most of us, especially women, have so much anger that when it doesn't get released, it turns into like resentment and like passive aggressiveness, or, just like anger with our words. Right. So like if you're in a yoga class or you're lifting weights or you're in a spin class and you're like getting even more angry, like that can be a sign that there's like an emotional charge that's coming up that needs to be released.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So the example that you were just bringing up, and I said it was like clicking so many things for me. So when my husband and I got home from our honeymoon, the day after, our dog was attacked in our front lawn. And he was on a leash, he was sleeping. The other dog was on a leash, and it was a horribly traumatic minute and a half of 5 adults trying to get this dog off of our dog.
Yeah.
And throughout the experience, it was so traumatizing for both my husband and I. And then our dog Bear, he was in the ICU for 6 hours. And I was like, when he survived it, thank God, I was so worried about how traumatized he would be. And it was funny because after time has gone on, the dog that had attacked our dog lives a couple doors down. And when we walk in that direction, I physically tense up so much. My heart starts beating. I get shaky. It freaks me out.
Yep.
He'll walk and not even care. Or he'll go lay in the front yard where he got attacked and it's like nothing ever happened.
Yep. Well, this is normal. Like this is actually how, and that's so funny because you're the one that you had like the secondhand encounter of it, right?
Yeah.
Like you saw the whole thing, but he's like, I'm fine. And because he was able to release it. So the example that I was going to give is like, if you think about, let's just imagine there's a bunny rabbit out in the wild and it's like chomping on some grass and then it hears a coyote. Like, let's just say there's a coyote and it hears the branch break. Okay. So then it goes into, it gets triggered, right? This is the circle. And then it looks back and it sees the coyote. So then it starts running, goes into fight or flight. Then it gets to a place when it can actually, like, it knows that it's safe again and its body will discharge. It will shake, it will make noises, it might do other things to discharge. And then it will kind of like bounce away and then it'll sleep. Then it'll wake back up like nothing really happened again. Right.
Yeah.
Another really, it's so interesting how we like aren't connected to our bodies this way. But another thing that I hear from my friends that have kids is like, oh, no one tells you when you go into labor, you start shaking. And I'm like,
Yeah.
or at
I've
the
heard
end of
that.
labor, you start shaking. I'm like, that's because your body is releasing the charge of labor. Or when you have surgery and you wake up, you start shaking. They're like, oh, we'll give you medication for that. And so it shuts down that process to actually release the charge that needs to be released.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is stuff I've never heard, and it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But I wish it was more talked about
Me
because I
too.
feel like this is stuff that I feel like would be mind blowing, and it will be mind blowing to everybody listening to this episode. But you had also said when you were explaining your story about disassociation. And I
Mm,
think that's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with and they don't know that they do it. Can you kind of walk me through what that even is?
yep. So the best way that I could describe it, and people that like disassociate know exactly what I'm talking about, is like you get this kind of like glazed over look. You cut off, like you can be here and you're talking, but you're almost like over here, you know? Or like when you're driving, you're like, how did I get from point A to point B? Right. And so what happens when you disassociate is that you get stuck in that fight or flight response, right? So maybe as a child, people yelled a lot. And so your coping strategy was to leave your body because you're like, this isn't safe here to listen to my parents fighting, right? But that release never happened. So your body is constantly going into that like old pattern, right? So it's very common. And the thing is, like, people are like, oh my gosh, I'm disassociating. Like, it's that foggy feeling that comes over you. Like, you can't really see straight, or like you kind of just check out. Like, I'll say to my clients, like, are you with me? And they're like, no, I'm not. And I'm like, I know, right? Because they're like checked out.
Yeah.
And it's very common and it's kept you alive. Like, is what I tell people is like, it did keep you safe at some point in your life because you learned this coping strategy that isn't, it kept you alive. It kept you safe at whatever point in your life that you needed to use it.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
And I'm sure now, even though if at some point disassociation was a defense mechanism, I'm sure people do it now, even when something traumatic isn't happening, just
Yes.
because their body defaults to that. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep. So if your like response, your fight or flight response is to freeze, when you freeze, you have a lot of disassociation. So there's like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, right? Fight is like you're either fighting physically, you're fighting with your words, which was me. There's freeze, which is like it says you're frozen. There's flight, which is like you run out of the room, you kind of leave the situation. And then fawning is also people pleasing. So when you get in a place of stress, you start people pleasing, right? So when people have, and I mean, this can show up in all of them, but specifically when people have the freeze is when they like completely leave their body and they disassociate. So if that's your go-to response, if that's your go-to kind of mode, then that's going to show up a lot stronger.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And most of this starts when we're a child, I
Yeah.
assume.
Yep.
So, can you develop new patterns with new trauma over time? Can it get stored differently with
Yeah.
different trauma as you get older? I know that's a very loaded question.
Yes. I mean, the broad answer is yes. I can tell you that, a big thing for me was around sexual trauma was a huge piece of my own story. And before I even remembered a lot of the things specifically from my childhood, I would just disassociate. Like I lived in this kind of glazed over space. And then as I started working on that, as my body started to feel comfortable to work on that trauma, then it's like this other fight or flight response came in, which was the fighting with my words, right? So I'm like, do you watch Yellowstone?
Yes.
I'm like Beth Dutton with my words. Like I will drop you
Love.
to your knees if you come for me. But that came online, which was like cool because that's actually I needed that fight response back then as a
Yeah.
kid. And I wasn't allowed to have it, right? It was taken from me to have that fight response. So there's different layers to it. And for sure, like if you have, another trauma in your 20s or your 30s or your 40s or anything, like it becomes compounded on top of one another.
Now, let me ask you, did you know growing up, whenever your trauma happened, did you realize that it was trauma then and there and that you carried it with you? Or did you realize looking back that it was trauma?
No, I had no idea. I thought that the things that I went through, specifically in my child, I had so much shame around them, like so much shame that I carried. And shame's such a big part of this. And that's why we do cut off from it because we're like, oh, like I wish I did say something or I wish I was strong enough or the stories that we tell ourselves, right? For me, when it really hit that I was holding this trauma in my body is when I got sick. And I knew enough about trauma recovery because I was 3 years into like intense trauma recovery when my body just like was like shut down, give up, like this is not happening anymore. Um, so I knew enough about it to know that there was this correlation. And the more that I started, diving in even deeper to nervous system work and all of this like moving trauma out of the body, I was like, oh, this is a manifestation, right? Because when you think about it, when you're in fight or flight for longer than it takes to outrun a metaphorical tiger, which is how long your body should be in fight or flight for, you have excess cortisol, you have excess hormones, your body is pumping different things out. And so it's going to manifest in either autoimmune disease or cancer. And that's how it does show up. I mean, there's many studies on this. So for me, I was like, oh, yeah, this is a physical manifestation of it.
Yeah, because it
Yeah.
had probably been in your body for so long.
So long. Yeah.
That's hard. I'm sorry you experienced that. And
Thank
it's,
you.
as you brought up, shame surrounding. I think it's very easy to carry that shame on such a deep level, thinking I should have done something, I should have said something, I should have told someone. Did you get to a place in the beginning of your healing journey where even vocalizing that to other people, you felt shame not only internally, but also you were shamed by other people?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, like, not to like laugh and like that's like such a sarcastic laugh, but really, people that were involved in the situation and weren't able to keep me safe, like, they just made it wrong. Like, no, that's not how this goes, or no, this is normal, or oh, this is how it's supposed to be. And just the thing is like when you start working on yourself and you start healing, you see, unfortunately, how unhealthy the people are around you. And so that has been a really big just journey of mine of being like, okay, it feels kind of lonely because you're like, I'm doing all of this work and no one's validating me the way that I need to be validated. And that's like a big piece of also the physical piece of it, right? Is like when you're not feeling validated, then you're storing that, you're shoving those words in even more. For me, it's like my first health thing was at 13, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. So, and I had gained like 30 pounds in 2.5 months. But that
Hmm.
was the last time that I had a sexual assault from my childhood. So
And
it's
you were
so wild.
13.
Yeah. Like
Hmm.
so wild how your body holds it in such a big capacity. And, I mean, there's so many stories of like when my health started to falter, but I wasn't conscious of it because you're so young, right? Like you
Yeah.
don't really know that stuff. Um, yeah, I remember like first grade, I didn't even go to most of first grade because I had so much anxiety that my stomach would hurt. And I would go home almost every day of first grade. Yeah. I mean, it's wild how much we store in our bodies, but we're like, oh, and especially doctors are like, oh, this is just normal, or this is that, or take this medication, or here you go. And like,
Numb
they
it.
push, yeah, numb it, push you off to the side of it. Yeah.
That's it's so tough when childhood trauma comes into any piece of it because when you're an adult and something happens to a degree, you can protect yourself to a
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah.
When you're a child, that you can't. That's not your job and you don't have those capabilities. When you started healing, I'm sure you felt a lot of resentment
Oh my
deep
gosh.
down.
Yeah.
Were you able to work through some of that resentment? Are you able to work through? I'm still asking for myself because I still have a lot of resentment from my own.
Yeah. It's like different layers, I think, for me. It's like we talk about in trauma recovery. Have you heard of like the spiral of healing?
No.
So it's like a spiral staircase is how you talk about healing. So like whatever you work through at like step 7 is going to come with you at step 8 and you're going to think you're going backwards, but really it's like just a new layer of it, right? And you can look at this spiral staircase as like you're going backwards and you're spiraling, or you can look at it as like you're still moving upward. So to answer your question is like, yeah, the resentment was so strong and I was so cut off from even feeling any anger. Like it took me a really long time to even feel anger. Because if you asked anyone, it's like, Allie's a sweet, bubbly girl who will do anything for anyone because it's like such fawn mode, right? Like going into people pleasing.
Yep.
And I was like, I'm not an angry person. And I just remember my trauma coach being like, you have so much anger, it is palpable because of the words that I would speak and how I would have this kind of like edge to me, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, definitely there's less resentment there, but it comes up. Like it comes up on in moments or when you do get triggered still, like it's definitely it's like that spiral staircase that I talk about.
That never ends. It just
Yeah.
keeps going and going. And that's the thing is I've never met anybody that is fully healed and there is zero negative emotion attached to anything they've ever experienced.
Yeah. I
I
don't
don't think
think
that's
that's
healing.
yeah. I mean, the way that I talk about it too is like it's like a scar. And like if you've ever had a scar, it's like sometimes if the weather changes or it's a different season, like maybe you feel it or it's there and you notice it sometimes. And sometimes you're just like, oh my gosh, I forgot I had this scar. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like different seasons and different layers. But that's how I look at, trauma recovery and mental health is that anyone that says that they don't have never experienced anxiety or depression, I say is living under a rock. Like you are
Well said.
so cut off from your body because it's normal to have these emotions. It's just about like whether or not you are working through them and if you're turning them in on yourself and like living in shame, I would
Yeah.
say is when you need more support.
So all of this trauma has happened throughout your childhood, leading up to the point where you're 22 and you have
Mhm.
these major losses happening in your life. Was there something about the losses that had any parallel to do with your trauma, or was it just such deep emotions that it just kind of opened up a can of worms, so to say?
Yeah. It was more just the deep emotion. So they always say that, when you shoved things down for so long, which I'm like the queen of shove. Like I had a badge in my head that I could shove the stuff down. Like listen to Beyonce, run it out. Like, girl power. It's fine. Don't let this ruin you. Like I literally felt like I wore a badge of being able to shove it down so much. And then when these deaths happen, it's like I had to feel my emotions because I was so overwhelmed with my grief that all this stuff came up that I had shoved down. It's like a volcano. You don't know what happens when you don't like we don't watch when a volcano goes from dormant to erupting, right? We don't notice that until it's erupting. And that was me. It's like I was
Yep.
just overflowing with all of it.
And so your first direction that you go for healing is what?
Is my first direction was I had done talk therapy before.
Okay.
So I had that kind of in my repertoire. I was like, okay, maybe that's what I need. So it was like going back to talk therapy. And then I heard of like CBT, which is cognitive behavioral for anxiety. Cause I'm like, that's what I'm having. I'm having anxiety. Like I'm just trying to place things. I'm just like grabbing at anything that you can at this point. And then I'm like, that's not really working. And then I had heard about hypnotherapy. Like hypnotherapy allows you to get closer to the event in your brain, but that didn't work. So still in my brain, like it's still all very cognitive. Um, and then I did the brain rewiring. And then I did, what was another one? EMDR, which works with like your eyes and repatterning your eyes, which like touches on the body because you're at least using your eyes and like the pattern that happens when you experience trauma, but it doesn't work with the actual body. Like these are all what we call like top-down approaches. So from the head down, they're not bottom up, which means like from the body up. Because when you think about it, when you have trauma, it's like you feel it in your body. When you have anxiety, it's in your stomach usually or your chest, right?
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
really in
That's a
your,
good point.
and then it comes up into your brain and then you're like, all of the stuff is coming on board, but it's in your body for the most part first.
Yeah. That's a
Yeah.
really good point that I've never really thought about. I've always thought it's like, yeah, your gut brain connection, which we hear about all the time, and that your mind over matter, where it's like, no, your body can have other plans.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you said it can get stored in our fascia?
Yes. So it gets stored in your fascia tissue, which holds 1,000 pounds of emotional charge. So that's why, I mean, and it makes sense, right? When you are in a workout class or yoga is a really big one because you're stretching out that fascia tissue, or you're going for a run. So you're kind of like pushing into the muscles in the fascia tissue. It's like, then people have these big releases where they're like, I feel like I can finally cry, or like I'm feeling this anger and then I'm working through it while I'm running. And like people get attached to that because it is giving them this kind of, I don't want to say generic release, but it is giving them some sort of release, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you bring clients on, or even through your experience before you became a coach, how are you working through this trauma? Is it certain exercises that you're doing? Are you working with somebody in person, virtually? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I worked with someone in person, and then now I do in person and virtual too. Um, but yeah, the in person was powerful because he does like myofascial technique, which helps release the trauma. Um,
Just by rubbing it out, basically?
yeah, I mean, it's like very intense. It's like
It's got to be painful.
it's painful. It's like very intense work. But for me, it's like because he had, done this with veterans and he had worked through veterans with PTSD, and I was diagnosed with complex PTSD at the time and developmental trauma. And so he was like, you need to come in and we just need to get this out of your body so you can even like find a little bit of relief. Right.
Is
So
complex PTSD different than PTSD?
it's complex. So there's like PTSD, right? Which is like usually an event. And then complex PTSD is when you have like multiple events that are on top of each other.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's called, and like when you are on, when you're looking at like literature, it's CPTSD is what they are abbreviating it to.
Wow. So when
Yeah.
he's working it through your body, are you guys focused on the stomach? Is it full
It's,
body?
yeah, it's really anywhere like, that's such a good question. It's following your body. So like you might come in that day, like TMJ is a great one. Most women are like, I'm gonna get Botox for my TMJ. And I'm like, well, actually, if you worked it out of your jaw, you wouldn't have it anymore.
Really?
Yes.
That's possible. And
Yes.
is that just manual
Yes.
working it out?
Yep.
Interesting.
So when you move trauma out, you want three things, which is you want breath, you want sound, and you want movement, right? So it's like when you're working it out, it's like if you're feeling anger or like you need to like, say words, or you need to like punch a pillow and scream it out. Like these are all like old emotions that are really powerful that people are like, oh, well, I can't yell and scream and punch a pillow because I'm going to think I'm crazy. And it's like, actually, that's just getting restored and recycled in your body, right?
Yeah.
So it's like these emotions are the things that you probably felt at the time that it happened when you had the said event, right? And now they're just getting recycled. So people are like, I don't want to do this. I'm like, I know, because it feels uncomfortable and no one's ever told you how to do it. So instead, you're actually bottling it up and becoming resentful and then being a jerk to your husband or significant other and saying like mean words, right? Like,
Boom.
yeah, that was me. I can speak from
Hey,
experience.
self-awareness.
Yeah, like you have two options. You either take it out on the pillow or you like stay in this and become Beth Dunn all over again.
Yep. You
Yeah.
chose the higher road.
Yeah.
But also the more difficult, because you
Very
have to
difficult.
deal with a lot of stuff that people don't want to deal with, right?
Yeah,
That you probably didn't want to deal with.
totally. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing is like when you start bringing your body online and healing, then like more things will start coming up, right? So I tell people that like it's almost like a dam, like a river and the dam, and you've like had this dam and you're filling all of this stuff in the water. And then we're just opening up the dam a little bit and everything wants to come out so quickly. So it can feel overwhelming in the sense because people are like, oh my goodness, I finally feel lighter and I'm not waking up with anxiety or depression or like my body's feeling better. And then it's like a week later, they're like, and now it's even more intense. I'm like, right, because your body's finally saying, like, you're listening to me. So here you go. Here's all the stuff that you've kind of shoved down and stored. So that's why it is harder because people don't teach us how to do this, right? People in school don't teach you, okay, you're having anger. Let's take it out in a healthy way. They say, like, you can't do that. Sit down in your chair and stay frozen, right?
Yeah.
So it's like then we're taught that our emotions and the things that we feel are not actually valid because no one's giving us a healthy outlet to release them.
That's so true. I'm just thinking about kids in school. Even now, like as adults, we've already been so programmed into what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, how we show emotions. Whereas when you're a kid, like you said, if you have anger or sadness or whatever, it's like, just shove it. Don't
Yeah.
show people that.
Yeah. Or if you do, it's like if you're upset, like I wish they had a separate room where it's like, okay, when you're upset, here's a punching bag, or like here's like a beanbag chair that you can just go to and let this anger out. But it's like, no, you get sent to the principal's office. Or so then everyone else is like, don't be like that person. Don't be like Jimmy. I'm just going to say a generic
Shame.
name,
Yep.
Then the shame comes in. So then anytime you feel that anger, you're like, well, I can't be like Jimmy because he's going to get sent to the principal's office and I want to be good.
I want to be good. I feel like that's especially for women, which
Oh,
obviously
yeah.
I can't generalize too much, but I feel like for women, when it comes into just people pleasing, smile, be polite, don't make your problems other people's problems. That then when you start taking charge of your healing journey, it's all consuming because it's the first time you've ever given yourself permission to deal with your own shit and
Yeah.
not filter it for other people, which makes people uncomfortable, especially the people that have always known you because it's
Yes.
different. So walk
Yes.
me through how your circle, you were married at the time, like as you're working through this stuff, how was it impacting not only the relationship you have with yourself, but the relationship with other people?
Mm. You know, the biggest thing was so when I was 22, my husband and I were not married at the time. So we were boyfriend, girlfriend. We were living together. And it when you're in an intimate relationship like that, it's going to be really confrontive because exactly what you said is like you working on your stuff is also going to confront their stuff subconsciously. And so thank goodness that Ryan was able to like do the work and still does the work today. But it's confrontational when you start going, oh, the way that I related to you is actually really unhealthy and it's because of my past. And then you start going like, oh, well, how do I relate to you now? And then they're like, well, you're changing, you're getting worse. Like all of these things starts coming up. You're like, actually, I'm not getting worse. I'm finally recognizing who I am. And that maybe this pattern or this way of relating is because I was shamed into this way of relating, or this is how I know how to get support and help, like is by being a people pleaser, which was my thing. Is like, I'm gonna make sure everyone's taken care of. Right. So, yeah, I mean, relationships change so much when you do the work. And I would say, like, for me, the biggest thing is just the biggest thing that I had to learn was like voicing what I was going through because I kept it in so much. So, when I was having a hard day or I was coming off of a session, being like, Ryan, like, I'm having a really hard time. Like, can you provide a little bit more space for me or like give me more time or just like really voicing that because I think that there's still shame that you're like, oh, well, oh, I should just be fine after I have a session or, oh, I should just be like, okay. Or these things are coming up. Right. And when I'm confiding in him, that's going to bring up his own stuff too. And because
Yeah.
we lost, we went on to lose 7 people in 2.5 years total. And they were from our same group for the most part. So it's like we both knew these people. And that brought it up. So there was also like trauma bonding in our relationship that had to get worked through because we were losing people so quickly over and over.
That's such a difficult layer to add on to something that's already difficult and painful. And you brought up trauma bonding, which is another term that I don't think people know really exists. So can you kind of go into that a little bit more and what that looks like?
Yeah. So, trauma bonding is essentially when you've been through a traumatic experience with someone and you get bonded by it. So, the way that you're relating is because you've been through this hard thing together. Most people will be like, that's why we're so close, is because we've been through this thing. And that's kind of what your relationship is built off of, is this closeness because of the horrible event that's happened. So, it creates this like almost false sense of closeness, of like intimacy, right? And we had to really work through that to get to know each other like outside of that, because we were bonded by all of these impacts of these deaths. And so it was like, how do you separate that and really see each other for who we are instead of, going through this experience together?
I'm sure that was far from easy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you went through so much loss in such a compact period of time. I feel
Yeah,
like
thank
that,
you.
and the fact that you chose to heal in the healthiest way possible, I applaud you for that, because I think it would be really easy to do the direct opposite and to numb and to not think about it and to not
Yeah.
focus on it. And it seems like it really just propelled you into wanting to heal on a deeper level. So when you're going into these in-person sessions, how many would you say you went to before you started feeling like, okay, this is working?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. There is a part of my story which is that I did go into numbing and had a really big, you know, am in recovery from alcohol, because that was a big thing when I was like 15, almost died of alcohol poisoning, was trying to escape my body. And then after these deaths, it's like I was drinking and not showing people that I was drinking. So having this
Mm,
really secretive addiction and problem was because of this pain that I was feeling so strongly, right?
yeah.
So I would say, I mean, it took a couple of years, like to actually get to understand that I was even having a problem with alcohol was a huge one. Like, and that I really needed to be clean and sober. Took Ryan and I got sober together 6 months before our wedding. So
Wow. When did you
yeah,
get married?
we got married in 2019, in June of
2019.
2019.
Okay, so 6 months before that. And take me through that realization that you guys were having an issue with alcohol and that you needed to get sober. Like, how did you come to that realization? Because I think there's a lot of people that can justify and just say that it's not a problem.
Yeah.
How did you know it actually was one?
I knew it was a problem from the time I like woke up in the hospital when I was 15, but then I had moved.
Okay,
I,
we gotta really focus on this real quick. Girl, you are truly so fascinating. And I'm so sorry for all of the trauma that you've experienced. My goodness, but you are a walking miracle. So
Thanks.
you're 15
Mhm.
and you wake up in the hospital.
Yeah, so I'm 15 and I had gotten raped and lost my virginity about 2.5 months prior to this. And like just once again shoved it down, numbed it all out. And my parents were in the middle of a divorce too. And I was actually
Mm,
grounded for drinking. But then my mom was like, okay, you can have a friend over. And then I was like, that means I can go to the parties, right? So went out to the parties, just in, inebriated, like so bad. Um, they said that I had like, I think it was like a point 0.3. You're legally considered at like a 0.30, and I think I was like a 0.32 or something. So they were like, what happened to her? I had gotten into the emergency room. I had like a black and blue bruise over my face. They did a CT scan because they were worried that someone took like a baseball bat to my head, but it was really because people were also drunk and they were trying to wake me up, that like they were trying to move me into the oh my gosh, what's it called? The shower. And it kept on like hitting my head. So all of this is happening. And then my mom, my sister, and I moved to Marin County, which is in the Bay Area, like a week later, right? And so I knew that I had a problem, but it's like I'm going to this new school. I was a freshman when we moved. So I'm coming into this new school as a sophomore. I'm grounded for a year because my mom's like, you're not going anywhere without me because this is happening. And then because I was like attached at my mom's hip, I like started dabbling in pills because I was like, oh, well, she can't tell that I'm drinking, but like I can also numb out this way. And it's like no one's knowing this. Literally, I'm hiding it so well, like literally so well. To this day, my best friends are like, I never thought that you really had a problem, right?
wow. And to
So,
do that so young,
so young.
it's amazing that you even like were able to hide that. Because normally when people are experimenting with something for the first couple times in developmental years.
Yeah.
You don't know how to control yourself. And it sounds
Yeah.
like you were.
Oh, yeah. I'm like a very controlled, like I am a control freak. So, and that's like part of the past too, right?
Yeah.
Um, so then you go to this brand new school and I kind of like reinvented myself because you're at a new school and hello, like that's just what you do. I went to the other school and everyone knew me from like kindergarten. So no one really knew my story. And I was still drinking, like going to the parties but like very controlled. Like I kind of was like, okay, you can't hit this one mark. So nothing really happened in high school. Then I went to college and I was like, I don't want to drink. I don't want to do this again because now everyone's like starting to drink. And I'm like, I don't want to do this. I know how this goes. And then I went, there were definitely multiple nights of having alcohol poisoning again. And then it's like I come home, get back together with my high school boyfriend, which is Ryan, move in together, have this beautiful home, like everything on paper is perfect, still numbing with alcohol. Ryan, on the same hand, has his own journey, started using substances when he was like in sixth grade. So very much like, it's in his developmental years. And the moment that we were like, we have to get sober was because your girl over here was going into this is the thing too, Jordan, is that whenever I would drink, I would get angry. Like all of my stuff would come up and I would be like, I'm pissed, I'm frustrated, all of this stuff, like this resentment came up very strong when I was drinking. And I would say things to people, I would hurt their feelings. Like this is where the Beth Dutton part definitely came out. And there was one moment, which is December 8th of 2018. We're at SantaCon in San Francisco, Ryan and I are. And I don't even know why, but I just go off on him. And this has happened a couple of times when we're drinking. I'll just like go off because I'll think that Ryan's someone else because my brain's kind of, when you're drinking, it's offline. And so I'm just going off. And I remember being in an Uber ride with Ryan and like the Thank You Next by Ariana Grande's out. And I'm just like singing it to him. We're like engaged, you guys. We're literally 6 months to get married. And I'm like going off on my fiance, singing this song with like so much attitude. And I'm like, who are you? But like, I can't stop because I'm just so triggered and I'm so pissed off. And so then that was a wake up call where he was like, we can never drink together again. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. And I was like, this is a problem. And this was like the big kind of straw that broke the camel's back. But there were definitely moments leading up to that where I had the same experience of like going off on a friend, going off on Ryan, like just being toxic in my own self because I was so overwhelmed by my healing and all the stuff that was coming up.
And at this time, since you and Ryan had been together since high school, did he know about the trauma that you had experienced? Was that a conversation?
He knew that I was raped when I was 15. So he definitely knew that in high school because, I mean, that definitely messes up just the way that you relate to someone sexually. Like yeah. I mean, that's a whole other podcast, I feel like, but that's a lot. So he knew that, but then we broke up in college and we got back together at the end of college. And that's when I started doing the more trauma work. And so as things were coming online, he was becoming aware of them because I was telling him, et cetera. So there was a lot of stuff that he didn't know from my childhood because I had forgotten about it that then, came out and revealed itself.
Yeah. And when you were raped and you left to be with your mom, did your mom know? Did your family know what had happened?
Mm-mm.
So again, you felt shameful that you
so
can't talk about it.
So shameful. Yeah. I completely blacked out from it. And like, I remember telling my mom, I think like a year and a half later, because she was asking like, why did you like drink so hard? And then I was grounded for literally a year. Like, no joke. I went to the bathroom. My mom went to my mom went to the bathroom. I stood outside the door with her. Right.
Wow.
And so she was like, we spend so much time together. So she would just ask me and I was like, oh, nothing. And then I remember telling her, I think a year and a half later, when I got out from being grounded, I was like, this is why I was reacting this way. And of course she had like no idea. Yeah.
And I'm sure as a people pleaser too, and as somebody that clearly you had a good relationship with your mom, you don't want to put your trauma onto somebody that feels like they could have, should have, would have protected you.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. There was like a piece of that. Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm I'm so sorry you experienced any of that. I think it's wild that you're able to go through a period where you are numbing to multiple different degrees throughout multiple chapters of your life. But I think if any of our listeners can relate to that, knowing that now you have created a business and a life for yourself of helping people either that have been through that experience or preventing them from ever getting to that point.
Yeah.
So when you decided, okay, we're going to become sober, that's 6 months before your wedding, that's still before your Lyme disease
Yeah.
diagnosis. So then you get this horrible diagnosis and you're getting IVs, what, for 9.5 months, you said? And you're
Yeah.
choosing to remain sober throughout that whole experience.
Yeah. Very hard. Very.
I'm sure it was nearly impossible. Can you walk me through that?
Yeah. I mean, it was hard. I will say, like, the thing, I don't know how much you know about Lyme disease, et cetera, but they
I
were
don't.
also they were using ketamine on me too. So, like, I say that, like, I was sober, like, in that I wasn't drinking and I wasn't using, but they were also giving me, like, so many things to keep me outside of my body to help me, like, reprogram my brain, et cetera, like doing DNRS and all that kind of stuff, because they were like, well, you have a pattern of staying in chronic illness, is what the doctors were saying. So they
Hmm.
were giving me, like, ketamine IVs to help with that. And they were like, this will also help with the trauma recovery piece of it. But what I, learned in that, and then they would give me, like, Benadryl and stuff because I would be breaking out in hives over the medication that they were giving me. So that whole time period, even though we were 6 months sober leading up to the wedding, I felt like for that whole next year and a half or so, I didn't feel like I was in my body and, like, 100% sober, because they were giving me different medications, or the pain was bad, or they had me on, like, tramadol for pain, right? So they were just pumping me. I mean, I was on 70 supplements and medications at one point. So they were
Seven
just
zero.
70.
Oh my God.
So they were just pumping me full of stuff, right?
Now, what exactly is Lyme disease?
Yeah, Lyme disease is a bacterial infection that, you get bit by a tick, and
Yeah.
then you it's in an acute stage, which is, when you get bit by a tick, you have a certain time period to reverse it. But then if you don't catch it, it becomes chronic.
So this could have happened to you again as a child.
Yeah. So we were thinking it probably happened around, like, 12 or 13 when I got bit, because
Wow.
that's
You
when a
get
lot of
bit
my
by a
health
tick.
stuff. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is there a cure?
I mean, the cure that I have found is through bee venom therapy. So I do bee venom therapy.
Bee venom.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mhm.
And your symptoms, are you able to manage them?
Oh,
And
yeah. I mean,
wow.
night and day. Before I had, like, I was having, I was diagnosed with seizures from Stanford. So they did, like, a 3-day EEG and all of this stuff, and had mold poisoning, all this, like, crazy stuff, and was in a ton of pain, couldn't think. I could not talk like this at all to you
Mm,
because my brain was just, like, on fire.
mm.
But my last symptom that we're navigating is just the fatigue, which is, like, the very last symptom. So, yeah, but
How much of your diagnosis do you think has to do with the trauma being stored in your body throughout your whole life?
I mean, 1000%.
Wow.
I think that I don't think that, like, Lyme disease is because of trauma, but I think that your body is weakened because of trauma, which then makes you predisposed to autoimmune and disease and cancer, right? So, like, another thing that I was diagnosed with is endometriosis. I had a life-changing surgery, but it's like 70% of women that have endometriosis have either been raped or sexually assaulted or molested. And it's like, no crap, because it lives in your body.
That's a damning statistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Holy crap.
Right.
Wow. So you got diagnosed with endometriosis at what time? After your Lyme disease diagnosis?
Yes. I got
Girl, your
diagnosed.
body.
I
I'm
know.
sorry.
Yeah. It went through a whole
Whew.
thing. Yeah. It went through a whole thing. After that was, like, in 2021. So
Okay.
we went through a whole journey of fertility and being diagnosed with premature ovarian failure. And then it was really like I had endometriosis, but the doctor at the time didn't see it. And so then I went to a different doctor, got endometriosis surgery. And this doctor, I'm telling you, if anyone has endo, like, please DM me and I will give you my free 30-page guide. But it changed my life. I was living in so much pain and he helped me. He's incredible. And I've sent like, I think 200 women at this point to him.
Wow.
Yeah, he's
I,
great.
I feel like maybe it's not becoming more and more common. Maybe it's just more talked about because I'm hearing this a lot lately and
Endometriosis.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's because it's one of those things too, like with trauma where it's like, oh, your period hurts. And then you're like, what? And then you're like, you shouldn't have this much pain. Like
Yeah.
you actually shouldn't have pain.
Do you think that any part of the healing, not only just from the procedure, but also with the trauma work, do you think the two is what really got you feeling so much better? Or do you think that at some cases it's like surgery intervention needed to happen?
Both, because I will say that I do talk to women that don't do the trauma work that go and get this procedure done and they're still riddled in pain because they haven't cleared it from their body. Like your body holds onto all of that. So just because you get an intervention doesn't mean that it's going to take away the years of pain and emotional pain that are stored in your body.
This is so fascinating. And the fact that this isn't just like widely talked about knowledge
Yeah.
is wild to me. But
Yeah.
it's almost like a natural way to try and heal yourself, but I'm sure it comes with a very long and very intentional journey that a lot of people like you have to be ready to go down it.
Totally.
So, when you got certified to do this, was it because you had gone through, worked with this gentleman, and you felt completely better and was like, this is what I'm doing with my life?
It was a combination. Yes, that for sure. It was like I feel so profoundly better and in my body and able to regulate, able to work through, things that come up that I'm like, people need to know about this. Like, I will scream this message from the rooftops for the rest of my life. And, you know, I never thought that, like I said that before, I never thought I would be doing this work. I literally went to college because I wanted to be the next Erin Andrews and like stand on the side with the cute football players and interview them. So I never thought that I would be doing this, but because I found my own profound healing, I was like, people need this. Like, and so that was really being in that IV room and having this like ego death, the kind of dark night of the soul moment was like, you can't go back to a 9 to 5 job. You have to like step into your purpose and really help people heal in this way. So that's the constant thing that drives me is like, I know how it feels to be broken and I know how it feels to literally want to like end everything and that you can still keep on going. And that's like the message that I just want to share to people is like, you can keep on going and there are other ways and like don't give up on yourself and your mental health because it can feel exhausting and daunting when people can't relate this way. Like I think when we talk about mental health, we only talk about one way that it's just talk therapy, but like it's not, right? And it didn't work
Yeah.
for me and it doesn't work for a lot of people. And I think that's where we do a little bit of a disservice is that people then go to talk therapy and they're like, well, it's not working for me. Something must be wrong with me. And it's like, actually, if you have trauma, it's stored in your body. So you're not going to out talk or out think or out negotiate it. Like it lives in your body.
This is even opening up my mind too, because this is stuff that, again, I've never heard of. And talk therapy was something that I got into in my mid 20s. And it did work in a lot of ways for
Oh,
me.
yeah.
But you had made a comment earlier that we do what, brain down
Yeah.
instead of body up.
Yeah.
And I think that just makes so much sense because, like you said, you can't outsmart trauma. Like it's going
Yeah.
to stay in there. So let's
Yes.
say somebody is like, I absolutely have to try exactly what you're talking about, but I want to know what it's going to look like
Yes.
before I go in. Like, am I going to be screaming into a pillow or like, how do we get to that point? Can you
Yeah.
kind of give an example of what a session looks like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I always work with where people's bodies are at, right? So, like the screaming into the pillow part is like for people that like really, I mean, it's different levels. And that's why what I've learned is that we're working with you at different stages of where your nervous system is. So, like most people that come in, I'm doing somatic experiencing with them. So, I'm just helping them body orient. I'm helping them go through that and complete that cycle. We're connecting to your body, right? So, it's a gentler approach. We're able to not like be so intense. It's not as like in your face and confrontational.
And when you say somatic experience, what
Yes.
exactly is that?
So somatic experiencing is the technique that Peter Levine came up with, which is the guy who studied the animals out in the wild
Okay.
and it's about helping your body complete that cycle. So what I'm looking for is when people go into what's called like they go into their trauma. Like I'm just going to break it down into really basic terms because I
Yeah.
can nerd out on this stuff. Okay, so like
Perfect.
they go into like their trauma and they're talking about their trauma and then we're going and we're helping them find a place on their body that feels safe. So a lot of the times when you talk about trauma, there's like, oh, I'm feeling it in my stomach. Oh, this doesn't feel good. Oh, I don't want to be here. So then they leave and they cut off, right? They disassociate. And then we're going to a place in their body that feels comfortable and safe and using that as a resource. So I know this sounds like really heady and super technical, but I mean, that can be just like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and it helps you to like digest. It's almost like adding digestive enzymes to your diet, right? Like
Yeah.
it helps you digest the emotion a little bit more. So that's usually when people come in, like if they're really coming in with a lot of, developmental trauma or they have PTSD or they're like, I don't know if I have trauma, but I'm living really outside of my body. And you talked about disassociation and I feel that like I would do some somatic experiencing with them just to help them even like be in their bodies and get like maybe even 30 seconds of living in their body because most
Mhm.
of us live outside of our body.
Yeah. And if someone were to be doing this with you virtually,
Mhm.
how are they able to get to that same point?
I mean, I work with most of my clients virtually. So
Wow.
we're doing like techniques and strategies and I'm, having them get up and do different modalities, etc. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how long would you say? I know everybody is probably a case by case basis,
Yeah.
but if somebody, let's just say, doesn't have any big T trauma, but is coming in because they do feel like they're starting to disassociate and they're just curious about this, is this like a 6-month process with you? Is it like a year? What does that look like?
Yeah. We usually start at around 3 months, but I will say most of my clients stay on 6 months to a year or more, just depending on where their nervous system is and where they're coming in at. And, I will say this is like if you have enough little T traumas, it's going to live in your body like a big T trauma.
Yep.
So I always give this example of like two people watch a car accident. There's like person A and person B. Person A comes from like a regulated home, meaning that people teach them how to release the charge from their body. It's like the ideal situation, right? Person B comes from a dysregulated home, holds on to trauma, doesn't know anything about mental health or trauma healing, right? They both watch a car accident. Person A does their tools and techniques to release the trauma. And maybe they're thinking about it for like another week, but it's really kind of in the back of their mind. They're not holding on to it. Like your dog, that example with your dog, right?
Yeah.
Like he's letting it go, right? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. He's letting it go. Person B is thinking about that car accident for 3 months and like wondering how that person's doing and seeing if they could call the hospital. And like they're constantly in it, right? So this is like, we have little t, we have big T traumas. We also have trauma is really about how it left your nervous system after the said event when we break it down at the basics, right?
Hmm.
So if someone's coming in, they're like, oh, I do have this a lot, Jordan. And they're like, I don't know if I have trauma, but like, you really spoke to me. So I'm here. I'm like, great. And then
Great. Let's dive in.
okay. And then we start working on it and memories are coming up or things are popping up or we're seeing this pattern in their nervous system or, they have this really intense, deep charge in their body that they're trying to release and they are releasing. So I say, we start off with 3 months, but 6 months to a year is what we're working with.
Now, would you recommend that if somebody is also in talk therapy supplementing with this, or do you think it's okay to come directly to you knowing that you are talking through these events and trying to just fully invest in this way of healing?
Yeah. Most of my clients have tried talk therapy and it hasn't worked.
Okay.
So I will say that a majority of them come to me after they've been in talk therapy. I also have had clients that have been doing talk therapy. I had a client that was doing talk therapy and then she was like, I fired my therapist because I'm getting more out of working with you. So I was like, do what you need to do, And like, this is not to hate on talk therapy. I think that speaking about it is so validating and important, but I know for myself and a lot of other people that it only gets you to a point because you can't out talk these things, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, it depends on where you are and what you can invest in and, how much where your body is too. Like if you're like, I've never done this work before, then like it's probably going to take you a little bit longer for us to help you get in your body and get in touch with like not cutting off all the time and disassociating.
Yeah. And so often healing can be all encompassing. It's all you're thinking about, it's all you're really focusing on. And for some people, they're able to set aside that time, where a lot of our listeners are moms, or they have corporate jobs, or they have different roles in their life right now that need them, that they can't just go away and heal for 6 months. Do you think it's possible to get on a healing journey that doesn't fully consume every bit of you?
1000%. 1000%. I think it's about finding easy, digestible things that you can do. And that's like, I've been there. I've been burnt out on my healing and completely overwhelmed by it. So I really try hard not to have people burn out because you can. Like, you open up Pandora's box. But I was there for like the first, 3 years of intense trauma recovery. And I remember just being like, I'm going to try everything. And then I'm like, I can't. I have a 9 to 5 job. I'm like planning a wedding. I'm doing all these things. Like I was teaching bar, like Pilates at the time. And so I had a really busy schedule. And so I do think like if you find a practitioner that you feel comfortable with and you love, like, of course, it does not have to be all consuming. And to like give yourself grace that you're not going to heal overnight. You didn't have this happen, or maybe you did. Never mind. You did have this happen overnight, right? But like you've carried this with you for many, many years. And so it's going to take some time and like give yourself grace because you're doing great.
Yeah. I think that's a message that everybody needs to hear. And also that I think it's what I'm getting the most, even out of just talking this through with you, is that even when you have specific instances that can trigger something a long time ago, if you're not aware of that, you can feel like, why is this bothering me so much? What's wrong with me?
Yes.
Why am I being dramatic? It must be my period. I think it's important for any woman that's listening that you got to listen to that
Yeah.
stuff, because your body is trying to tell you something, and it will continue trying to tell you something until it gets to a point like what you and I have both experienced, where it's like now you're forced to deal with it because your body shut down.
Yes. And I have a lot of people that come in that are like, I don't want to get to that point that you did. So like, can you help me to not get there? I'm like, great. Yes, of course. Yeah.
I heard you talking on your podcast about some of the, I forget the terminology that you used, by like the benefits of trauma. I know that's not what.
Yeah.
What were you saying regarding that? Because I think that we only talk about the negative parts of trauma, and I'm shocked that there are positives of it. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah. Post-traumatic growth is
The
like
post-traumatic growth.
a huge thing that we don't talk about in trauma, that we don't really talk about. So there was this study done by Stanford, and they had these people come up and put all of these horrible things that have happened to them. And they said, here's an eraser. If you can go up to the board and erase all these bad things that have happened to you, would you do it? But the caveat is, if you erase all of these things, you also erase all of the lessons that you've learned along the way because of them. And no one walked up to the board and erased them, because the things that have happened to you, as horrible as they are, have also made you grow. And that's when we talk about post-traumatic growth, is like, I wouldn't be here today talking with you and running a business about this if I didn't go through those things and learn these lessons, and also, be broken down to my knees multiple times and like build myself back up. So when we talk about post-traumatic growth, it's leaning into those lessons and not letting the things that have happened to you define your present or your future, right? Which was me for a very long time. I was like, this is defining me. But then there was a moment where I'm like, this doesn't have to define me. And because I feel better in my body, like it's not resonating as much, right?
And I'm sure your clients all feel that same way.
Yeah. Yeah. They get those, like, it's like a breath of fresh air. Like you're like, oh, this feels so good. I'm not constantly on alert. I'm not looking over my shoulder. I'm not scared about the next thing that's going to happen.
I'm not
Worried about
physically sick.
Yes.
I'm not anxious.
Yes. Not worried about the next shoe that's going to drop, the metaphorical next shoe that's going to drop. Yeah, it
Yep.
feels
And that's
good.
stuff that in society, I feel like it's so relatable that it's like, oh, we all feel that way. It's fine.
Yes.
Where it's like, you don't have to feel that way though.
Yeah. The busy badge, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I used to actually pride myself off of being really great in stressful situations.
I feel like that's a skill set. If you were to tell
Yes.
somebody that, they'd be like, oh,
They're like,
fantastic
great.
skill set.
Yeah.
And you're
Yeah.
like,
They're like
no.
hired. Yeah. 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 I mean, but that was it because I had lived in fight or flight for so long that I'm like, oh, I know this so well. So bring it on. Like you want to throw a huge event, I'm your girl. You know, something bad happens, I'm your girl. Like you just plot me in and I can handle it.
And now that you're healed,
Yeah. Yeah.
you're like,
Yeah.
no, I don't want to be stressed out all the time.
Now that my nervous system's at like a regulated spot for sure. I'm like, this actually, but it can become addicting because
Mm-hmm.
that's like the pattern that you know. So it's scary to go the other way sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it's really empowering to know that healing is possible. No matter
Yes.
what you've been through, healing is possible.
Yes, for sure. It is.
So if our listeners want to come and work with you one-on-one, do you take one-on-one clients?
I do. Yeah.
And do you offer group as well?
I don't do group, but I have a self-paced course as well. If you're like, I don't know about this, this girl's like saying a lot of things I'm not really sure about. I have a self-paced course as well for people that want a lower investment, but they still want to do the work and be able to digest it. So that's a great option.
Amazing. And you still have a podcast
I do.
as well, so people can come and learn more about you, your story, your practices. What's your podcast? Where can people find you?
Yeah, my podcast is It's Okay to Not Be Okay podcast, hosted by Allie Cates. So that's like my message.
The best message, best title ever.
We have to have you on.
I would love to anytime.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for giving us, gosh, over an hour. I feel like I could talk to you literally forever. You are so fascinating. Your story is beyond inspiring. And I think the fact that you went through so much trauma and heartache and have now used it to help other people work through theirs is beyond admirable. And I really, really applaud you. And I feel very grateful to know you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jordan. Same. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, anytime. If you're loving our pod, please take a moment to follow, download, rate, review, and most importantly, share with a friend. These small steps help us continue bringing amazing content every single week. Make sure you're following us on Insta at More Than Inc. and subscribe to our newsletter at morethaninc.com for exclusive More Than merch drops and info on in-person meetups. We appreciate you chilling with us and are always here to remind you you are so much more than. We'll see you next week.